From Wana Brands, welcome to Enhance Your Life. I'm your host, Jonathan Small, and each week I talk to people from all sorts of professions and backgrounds about how cannabis has enhanced their lives and how this healing plant can enrich your life too.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Enhance Your Life podcast. My name is John Small and I am your host, and I am delighted this week to bring you my guest, Sara Payan. And Sara is the host of Planted with Sara Payan. She's also a cannabis educator and a public education officer at the Apothecarium dispensaries. And she's an award-winning public speaker and a public policy advocate and writer. That's a lot of hyphens and things like that. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John, for having me. I'm really happy to be here. And I know it was a lot of stuff. I just love all things cannabis, and I have always been into communication in all its forms.
That's wonderful. Well, I want to get into that. Tell me a little bit about how you got into cannabis, into the cannabis business. Tell me a little bit about your origin story.
Yeah, in some ways, it's probably not so different than a lot of people who have gotten engaged with cannabis. And in some ways, it might be a little bit, I don't know. But when I was in my late 30s, when I was 37, I was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. And my mom is a cancer researcher. She just recently retired. She actually did the clinical trials on FOLFOX5, which is what I ended up taking years later. So it was a blessing and a curse. She knew the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I was a constant challenge for my oncologist because I'd be like, so I heard this could make me go blind. And they're like, who told you that?
Oh, man. Yeah.
Like my mom who did the clinical trials. Hey, the truth hurts, but I need to deal with it. But there were some concerns that I had going through chemo. I had a resectioning, and then they found out that it had gone outside of my colon. So I had 6 months of chemo, and I was worried about nausea. I was really scared about nausea. And a lot of these pharmaceuticals that we get prescribed, they're well-meaning, but they have gnarly side effects, especially for certain types of cancer. So my anti-nausea drugs and the opiates that I was using after my resectioning had the lovely side effect of being constipating.
Ugh.
And with stage 3 colon cancer, you think about that as being unpleasant, but you don't think about it being able to kill you. But when you're dealing with stage 3 colon cancer, that's pretty dicey. So I was able to forego using my opiates, which actually I had to use them for a little bit after surgery. And I've always been one of these people that I don't have an addictive personality. In my early 20s, my doctor's like, you have asthma, you have to stop smoking. I just stopped smoking. My friends were like, are you an alien? But it was really, really weird how once I stopped taking the opiates, how my mind didn't want it, but my body was getting like restless legs and dealing with all these things with that. And cannabis actually helped me make the transition out of using opiates without that discomfort, but it also helped me with my pain management. And then using cannabis instead of my anti-nausea drugs, I'd use my Zofran my first day of my infusion because I was infused for 3 days in a row. And then I would switch over to cannabis. And my ritual, when my nurse would come home to my house to unhook me, was to smoke a bowl of Blue Dream and go to my cafe and have some huevos rancheros. That was like my jam.
That doesn't sound terrible.
No, it wasn't. It was actually a really nice ritual to kind of close it all out, But prior to working in cannabis, I worked in nonprofit, primarily in civil rights. And when I finished up with my treatment and I took a year off of work and was really doing some soul searching to see what I wanted to do, I decided I was going to go back to school for organizational psychology. And during the very last part of my chemo journey, I actually met Ryan Hudson, who's the CEO of the Apothecarium, or he was. He has since left the company, and he's just a lovely, lovely person. But we became friends because there was an ice cream that they had in the store. And the week that I went in was a chemo week. And you can't have, with my type of chemo, you would have a lot of issues with neuropathy. So you couldn't have anything cold or you choke on it. So I was like, okay, this is not the week for ice cream. But the next week I stopped by and they were like, well, we don't have it because the Department of Public Health said that you can't have anything refrigerated or frozen sold in stores. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous. We get sores in our mouths when we go through chemo, and it would actually be really soothing along with giving effects that we want. And so they said, well, would you write a letter Sure.
Right.
I mean, I worked in civil rights. Letter writing was like my jam. Like, let's write a letter.
Letters. Yeah.
So we became friends. And then when I was doing consulting and going back to school, I ran into Ryan in the dispensary and he's like, "Hey, Sarah, you still looking for a job?" And I thought, ooh, I don't have to like do my big girl job. It'll be like being at a bookstore or a coffee shop, and I could go to school. And I told him I'll stay for 4 years. And it's been over 10.
Wow.
And since then, I started the education program at the Apothecarium. I was actually the first education. I believe, a lot of people in cannabis from way back have been into education. It's nothing new. We're starting to see more focus on it, but I was the first dispensary director of education in the world, like official,
Right.
which is kind of weird, but that doesn't mean education wasn't happening. I just was the first person who had the title. And then I switched from that to public education officer for the Apothecarium. So I started with my cannabis and cancer class because a huge part of my getting better was being able to help other people. Because when you're done with chemo, nobody tells you, well, now you have to learn how to be yourself in a whole new way and get healthy. It's a very different thing. And it can be shattering for people because they're like, okay, I'm done with this treatment. And now my body's broken. I've gone through all this mental trauma. And a lot of things just don't resonate for you. You don't feel the same. You don't relate to things the same. And so you have to I always tell people, once you're done, it's time to learn how to be yourself in a whole different way. And I've loved my work in cannabis. Needless to say, I did not finish my degree in organizational psychology.
Nope. Each went a little bit of a different direction.
I went a different direction, but like my critical psychology background really helps with the conversations around cannabis and critical thought, and really talking to people about what can work well for them, making recommendations, but really creating a safe container for experimentation to empower people to figure out what works well for themselves, because we're all super different. And when I teach a class, I always tell people, if you come to my class, you read a great book on cannabis education, you look at some research, what you're looking at is, what the majority of human beings, how they respond to cannabis. And we're all different. We're walking chemistry experiments. And it's fascinating because I work with thousands of people. I have over 18,000 hours of experience with human beings in cannabis. And I've seen some really interesting anomalies. You lean in and you're like, so what happened? How did you feel? What was that? And collecting that information helps me help other people. Yeah. So I love what I do. And then that's gone into my writing for Cannabis Now and Rolling Stone Culture Council and my podcast and just all. And when I'm not at the Apothecarium and we're not in the pandemic, I travel and teach, cannabis education, and I lecture about cannabis policy, because I was also the co-chair of the San Francisco State Legalization Task Force, which was the first task force of its kind in the nation. And I did that for 3 years, and now I'm on oversight committee. So we're really looking at ways to not only support the community, but the industry. And then for me, it's also helping patients, because we're seeing, we started all of this on the back of medical cannabis, right? And recreational is fine and good. I smoked cannabis for years before I used it, what I would consider therapeutically. I think everyone should have a right to have safe access to it, no matter what you call it. But I feel like the medical patients have kind of gotten the shaft recently.
For sure. What a story, Sarah. You're amazing. How are you now? I have to ask, how is your health now?
Thriving.
Yay. That's wonderful.
Thank you. On August, it's 11 years.
That's so exciting. Well, you look fantastic, and what an amazing survivor story, and what an inspiration. It's incredible. So you're so right about cannabis being very personal, that it affects different people different ways. What's the best way, do you think, for people to understand what cannabis works for them? Like you said, if you're looking for medical cannabis, it's hard these days, right? Like I recently have been looking for medical cannabis. I'm looking for cannabis to help me with my anxiety, but I go into a dispensary and the bud tenders are sort of more trained to talk to people who want a lot of THC. That's kind of like, they don't always know. So how does one seek Education. I'm sure it'll be very different if I went to Apothecarium,
Apothecarium?
Yeah. Is there one in LA? We'll have to talk, but,
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. But anyway, so what do you do? What does somebody do if they want to be more educated about cannabis in this day and age?
Well, there are some good books out there if you're a reader.
I'm a reader.
I like the book The Cannabis Pharmacy because it has some really great information both in layman's terms and things that people that have a little bit more experience can get out of it. And I teach classes every other Thursday. I teach a class at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Zoom, and it's free.
What?
Yeah.
Tell us how we can find that. I mean, I'm going to ask you to tell us at the end of it, but I might as well ask now. How can people find that class?
So they're on Eventbrite, and they're on the Apothecarium's California events calendar. Right now, I'm about to populate it for Q2 because I'm doing a very different thing than I normally do. Usually in the beginning of the year, I throw all my classes up and I'm like, that's what's happening for the next year. But we're looking at talking to other people, like how I do in Planted. I'm going to do a regular class, and then once a month, I want to do some special programming with other people who are working cannabis, because I joke that you could spin a wheel behind me and wherever it stops, I could talk about it with the exception of cultivation, because I do not have a green thumb.
Okay.
But there's so much more to the conversation than what I have to offer around cannabis. So what I'm looking at this year is doing some of my regular classes, but then also bringing in people from the cannabis industry to have more talks, more nuanced conversations about lesser cannabinoids or some of the research that they're working on, perhaps with like women's bodies and cannabis, or even having somebody come in and really like dig deep into concentrates, because I love them and I know a lot about them, but there are definitely people who are nerdier than me. I am a conduit to help people understand things in layman's terms. And I love to get nerdy. I actually have to be really careful with my language because my husband says, sometimes you go into the rabbit hole and you start pulling out these words, Sarah. So
yeah.
try really hard to like make it accessible for people. But just this year, my goal is to really give a fuller experience and deepen it. So the calendar will be up very shortly. So stay tuned.
Okay. We'll definitely stay tuned for that. So people ask you, I'm sure, all the time about cannabis and all these courses you teach and what is the most common question that you get about cannabis? Like where do people usually start, or is there even a most common question? Like what are the 3 most common questions you get?
Oh,
let's start with 3. Yeah. Because the most might be a little daunting.
Well, one of the questions is, especially for people who have either never used cannabis before or are coming back to use it after it's been a really long time, especially if there's somebody who maybe liked it in the 60s and 70s or early 80s and are coming back to it now, is the fear of getting high. Mm-hmm. Will I get high? What will that be like? Or, there was a gentleman who'd never used cannabis, but had a really bad experience on LSD and said, is it going to be like that?
You're like, no.
I promise you, no. So, there's that. There's also, actually, my most well-attended class in the past 2 years has been sleep anxiety and depression. So a lot of people ask about working with anxiety, and a lot of people ask about sleep. Sleep has been a huge one this year. And then there's also the question about THC percentages. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's very interesting. I won't dive into every one of those because it's worth an entire podcast, but I am curious about sleep and what you recommend. Like, what are some of the thoughts you have about cannabis and sleep?
Well, you want to look at it. We're all really different. So there are lots of different reasons that we're not sleeping. So the first question I'll ask is, are you having problems getting to sleep or staying asleep? And then I'll say, is there anything else that's helping you or actually hindering your sleep? So is it anxiety? I have, the hamster wheel at night. I start thinking about all the things that I need to do the next day, or if I forgot to do something.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's, did I really say that?
Right.
Or it could be discomfort. And if it's discomfort, what kind of discomfort is it? What kind of pain are you looking at? And is this something that cannabis can address? So It's really interesting because people, especially that are having problems with sleep that are very new to cannabis and they have conversations with their doctor, they'll always come to me. They're like, I want CBD for sleep. I heard CBD helps with sleep. And CBD isn't particularly sleepy or uplifting. It's more about homeostasis.
Yeah.
Now, some people do get drowsy off of it. And if they do, hey, use what works for you. That's great. But normally I recommend CBD when you have issues with anxiety or a busy mind at night combined with THC.
Yeah.
Or if you have any sort of nerve pain or inflammation that's making it really uncomfortable for you to sleep, combined with THC. But THC is what's going to create a lot of the drowsiness. CBN for some people works really well. I haven't seen as many reports of it working on its own as effectively as combined with THC. I actually like a CBN CBG combo for if I have to get up in the morning and I'm not a really good early morning person. THC might make me a little bit drowsier in the morning. So I'll have something that's non-euphoric that calms my mind and makes my body drowsy. So there's a lot of different things that you could look at. You could also look at if you're having problems getting to sleep, using a sublingual or inhaling cannabis is a really efficient way to promote a good night's rest. If you're having problems staying asleep through the night, you want something that stays in your body for a longer time. So you're going to want something like an edible. You could still use a sublingual, but I use sublinguals also for getting to sleep because they're fast acting, just like inhaling cannabis. And if you're inhaling cannabis, we can actually talk about terpenes. So you could be looking at adding some linalool or some myrcene into the mix in the evening for sleep. And if you're looking at a topical aspect, doing like bath bombs, like, THC bath bombs or a 1-to-1 ratio, those can be really nice to create a relaxing environment for you to sleep, because normally topicals, unless they're transdermal applications, are completely non-euphoric. But if you're totally immersing yourself in the bath, you have lots of lovely mucous membranes in our genitalia, so you will feel groovy after you soak.
I did not realize about the mucous membranes in the genitalia. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, my husband is not a bath guy, but I made him try some Epsom salts that were infused, and he got done and he was like,
whoa.
I'm like floating 2 inches off the ground. I'm going to sleep like a baby tonight.
And it doesn't make you high. You can't get high in a bath, or can you?
You will get a little bit high. It won't be uncomfortable, but you definitely will, because you're getting a very similar reaction to if you take in a tincture. It's a sublingual, it's getting into the mucous membranes, getting into the bloodstream.
Interesting.
So if you used it as, like, say you had sore feet and you used it as a soak, you wouldn't. But immersing your body, absolutely you can.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I saw recently that you wrote an article about edibles, and being that this is Juana's podcast and Juana specializes in edibles, I'm curious, things you sort of should consider before, sort of edible etiquette, things you should consider before taking edibles, and can you talk to me a little bit about edibles?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because there are a lot of people who get a little nervous about edibles and they shouldn't. Maureen Dowd wrote a really unfortunate piece.
Yes, everybody's read that piece.
The worst investigative journalism ever. Never even considered dosage.
Right. Just took a cookie, ate a whole cookie or whatever she did, a brownie, and that was it. Yeah, that was
it. And I was so mad when I read that years ago. I was like, who does that?
Bad PR. Yeah, I know.
But it's about, if you are new to edibles, you'll hear this time and time again, slow and low is the way to go, because our goal is to find the ideal ratio at the lowest volume that creates the desired reaction in the body, right? You want to make sure that you put in time for metabolization, because it's going to take an hour to an hour and a half many times, unless you have something that's nano-emulsified, and then you'll have a faster reaction because it has faster access to your body. You want to make sure that you don't have a lot of food in your stomach, because that'll dull or delay the effects. Having a little cookie or a cracker, however, is not a bad idea, because THC binds to fats and sugars, and it can actually help deepen your experience. And then you need to really know the window of time, because we're looking at about 4 to 6 hours. I love edibles because they last in the body much longer. And if you're looking at it from like a financial standpoint, that's a much better buy for a lot of people. And if you're looking at it from a medical cannabis standpoint, it is, if you want to have something that'll replace a pharmaceutical and have that same staying power, an edible will. If you are having problems with being anxious during the day and you want something that's going to work well for you, or pain management, using an edible is great for that. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm dealing with pain, so I'm smoking cannabis. And it's like, well, then you're smoking like every hour and a half to 2 hours. And is that what you really want to do? And how much product are you going through then if you're doing that? Whereas edibles, you can take it a couple times a day. It's efficient. You have a long window of feel. And I just really enjoy that. And there's so many amazing edibles to choose from. There's something for every taste. And I always tell people, not only look at the cannabinoid count of your edibles, but also look at the format. Get something that you're going to enjoy.
Right. Something that tastes good.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And it's so nice.
It doesn't always have to be a sweet flavor, but I mean, those we start there with the really good gummies, but yeah.
That's it. And the gummies, and people are always worried that gummies are going to taste really funky, but those days are gone.
Yeah, I know. They've definitely fixed that problem. You mentioned edibles for people with anxiety. For somebody with anxiety, is that a hesitation I would have with that is just, I wonder if, because it's a little bit unpredictable when the high is going to kick in, and that can make you a bit anxious. I know this, I'm speaking from experience here. I'm wondering whether that is necessarily the best format for a person with anxiety. I like the idea that it lasts all day, because people with anxiety don't want to be anxious. So it's nice to have a kind of cool thing for the rest of the day. But I think it's that surprise. I guess if you know it's coming, it's less surprising. But what do you tell me? I'm just speaking now, but you tell me what's right and what's wrong.
Well, I think that that's a very valid concern if you're taking more THC than your body needs. And the one thing to remember with cannabis is that cannabis is biphasic. So small and larger doses have different effects. Low doses of THC, and we all need to know for ourselves what a low dose is for us individually, can actually help with anxiety and stress and give you just a little bit of lift in mood. You have more than you need.
It crosses over, to the other side.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but there's also the fact that you can get stuff that's really low dose THC that actually has a good deal of CBD in it. So you're not even dealing with that. There are products that have just enough THC to fully activate CBD to what we refer to as the entourage effect. And you can go with that. So you don't necessarily have to commit to high doses of THC when you're working with your edibles. And remember, edibles are also easily dividable. So you can do the math and figure out what's going to work well for you. Don't do the after school special moment where you take, think, 10 milligrams sounds great.
Yeah.
My friend does that. I can do it. Well, your body is not the same as your friends. Like if you're new to it and you're feeling like you're having anxiety, start with like a milligram or two and see how you feel.
Right. But
I'll tell you, one thing that I really like too for anxiety, aside from CBD or maybe very low amounts of THC, CBG. It's my favorite cannabinoid these days.
Tell us about CBG. What is CBG?
So CBG, or cannabigerol, we refer to that as the mother cannabinoid. All cannabinoids start out of that. Actually, it's CBGA that they turn it as. And then as the plant develops, all the other cannabinoids develop as well. And CBG is non-euphoric. It's really great for a lot of people for helping with stress and anxiety. It can also be really good for getting people eating if they don't want to have euphoric effects, but they want to have something that gets their appetite going. And I found I love CBD, but sometimes CBD, even though it doesn't get me high, it can get me a little bit spacey with my neurodiversity. So using CBG, I'm actually really clear-headed. I'm creative. I get things done. Like if I've got a deadline for an article and I'm freaking myself out going, oh my God.
Yeah.
But what am I going to write? Even CBG gets me back in my body and I'm very functional, because THC can be really creative, but it can also be really distracting depending on your body and how much you're using. Whereas CBG, you don't deal with that. And so I really like that. And I like that a lot in edibles too.
such good advice. I'm writing all this down. I mean, it's like, you're a wealth of information here. How do you use cannabis in your own life?
Yeah, I have residual neuropathy from chemo. So I like to use a 2-to-1 ratio CBD to THC to help with that, because I don't like to use pain medication if I don't have to. But if I do, I will.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have anything against pharmaceuticals. I just try not to use them very much.
Yeah, I understand.
You know, they're a tool. And then I like to get high. You know, when my day is done, I like to have a couple puffs of something, and I'm more of a hybrid to indica person. I'm the kind of person who can smoke Granddaddy Purple in the middle of the day and not fall asleep. Although I don't do it in the middle of the day because I'll be distracted and not do my work.
Yeah.
But on the weekends I could do that. So I really like smoking cannabis. I love edibles. I love all the different ways of being able to use it. But one thing I really love is when I go to things like Hall of Flowers, which is an industry event where we're purchasing samples.
Were you there this year in Palm Springs? Did you go to that one?
I went to the one in Santa Rosa.
Right.
It was so nice to see everybody again.
I know. If anybody ever can, for those listening, if you have a chance to go to Hall of Flowers, it really is a wonderful event. It's in Santa Rosa and in Palm Springs, I think.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Yep.
And the beautiful thing about it is you get to see all these really creative edibles and projects that people are doing. Like I picked up these beautiful French macarons last time.
Oh, I wrote about that. That was, yes, they were so cool. What was his name? Hervé or something? Yeah.
And they were so nice.
Nice people from Canada, from Toronto originally.
Canadians are always nice.
I know. Tell me about it. I was just in Vancouver. Well, you're very nice. Are you Canadian?
I'm from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I'm a Yooper, and we sound Canadian. I'm almost Canadian.
You're almost there. So you're half nice. You're almost nice.
Almost nice. I've been in California long enough
to be jaded.
I guess it should be the East Coast to get my edge.
Yes, that's where I'm from. And that, then to take California, then beats it out of you. All right. So you have this great podcast called Planned with Sara Payan. Tell us about that. Like what can people learn on that podcast?
Yeah, so Planted is a discussion about cannabis in many different areas. I've had people like 3-star Michelin chef Dominique Crenn on there. We talked about her cannabis journey and also her collaborations with Rose LA. If you haven't checked them out, they've got some amazing little Turkish delight things. They've been doing these collaborations with people like her and Enrique Olivares, who's like amazing chef. I recently had the former head of the Republican National Committee on, Michael Steele. And
surprisingly a cannabis advocate. I met him at an event a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's a really fun guy to talk about, and he loves to learn. I didn't even realize until I did a little research on him before he came on the show that he was in education. He used to be a teacher. Mm-hmm. And then people like my old editor from Cannabis Now, who's now the editor-in-chief of High Times, Ellen Holland. She was my very first guest. So, and then people like Mara Gordon, who is really deep into medical cannabis. So I touch on different aspects, either how it's touched people's lives, if they're working in policy, what their views are on it, talking to people who are running farms, who have brands, all the different ways, but always with a focus on education and educating. Not only, I know sometimes people think, oh, it sounds a little B2B, but it actually is B2C as well, because I get a lot of people not in the industry listening and learning, because people don't understand what happens behind the scenes. People don't understand when cannabis products are either unavailable or expensive, that it's not the company, it's not the dispensary. In California, it's the taxes.
Yeah.
I just really want to normalize cannabis and get people to understand what's going on about it, engage them in the conversation, but also it's a perfect opportunity to engage people in civics, because we've become so passive on our voting or talking to our policymakers. And this isn't just about cannabis. This is about everything. We have so many things going on in our country that people need to have a say on. But with cannabis, a lot of this policy is built on the fact that your policymakers are pretty sure that most of you aren't going to say anything about it, except for the few people that are out there with their signs that have been there since day one. And they're like, oh, they're a bunch of stoners. I don't need to pay attention to them. So the public needs to come out of the cannabis closet, say, I'm a highly functioning member of society that contributes. I pay taxes. I use cannabis. And guess what? I vote.
Yeah. That's the most effective tool that we have, right? Voting.
Yeah, it is.
Because I was going to ask, what can we do to become advocates in our own life as far as policy goes? Because it is really, cannabis is one of those issues that Republicans and Democrats generally agree on. I mean, it's kind of one of those rare issues that actually crosses party lines. I think it's like 60 or 70% of people think it should be legalized in the country. But there's still a stigma. And like you said, even like the lawyers and the people who are considered, nobody would ever consider to be a stoner are big users of cannabis. And yet when it comes to advocating for it in a public way, they're very quiet and almost embarrassed by it.
I always say conversation is normalization. That's like the premise of my podcast. Like, let's talk about it. I was surprised when I started working in a dispensary how many different people use cannabis. Like, I had somebody, I'm not behind the bar anymore, but I remember somebody saying, oh, you must be tired of dealing with stoners all day and all these people. What? I was like, I don't think you understand. Like, if you spend an afternoon in my waiting room and everybody uses cannabis of all walks of life, of all ages. And I actually, when we talking about that, when people say, oh, seniors are the highest growing population of cannabis users, my waiting room was primarily gray from the get-go. It's just that they grew up in the time of the war on drugs and they kept their business to themselves.
Yep. That's interesting. Yeah. They're just the silent majority. Well, that's fascinating. Sara, how can people find out more about you aside from listening to your podcast every week, which they should definitely do, Planted? Where is there a website they can go to?
Yeah, I have a couple of websites. So if you want to check out some of my educational work, some of my articles, things like that, you can check out my private practice site, which is sarapayan.com. Planted does have a website as well, which is just plantedwithsara.com. On Instagram, I am Sara Mitra Payan. On Twitter, I am Sara M. Payan. And Facebook, how many people on Facebook anymore?
Well, maybe some of the seniors on that use cannabis are on Facebook, because I know that my mom's generation is definitely on Facebook.
I still do Facebook. I still have a lot of interactions with people, and I do a weekly Ask Sara video where somebody sends me a question and I answer it. And I put it on IG first, but it always goes on Facebook. And because we do have more generations on Facebook, I tend to get a lot of my questions off of that. So that is Sara Mitra Payan on Facebook.
That's terrific. Well, Sara, thank you so much for coming on the show. Goodbye, everybody. Until next week, we'll talk soon.
Enhance Your Life is brought to you by Wana, the #1 infused product in North America. Wana's entire process is designed to deliver the same great experience time after time. They have spent years fine-tuning their recipes so that their products are delicious, consistent, and potent. For more information, head on over to wanabrands.com. That's Wana, W-A-N-A, brands.com.